All right, thanks for joining us today, everyone. Today we're going to talk about risk analysis and analytics with Safran Risk. My name is Ian Nicholson. I am the VP Solutions at Emerald Associates. I'm a risk analysis trainer and consultant. I've conducted risk analysis in many industries, starting in about 1997. I started working with schedule risk analysis when Emerald Associates became the Canadian PERT reseller in 2001. And then that was purchased by Primavera, which renamed it Primavera Risk Analysis. And then, of course, Primavera was purchased by Oracle. Joining me today is Mary Lynn Backstrom, who's an implementation specialist with Emerald Associates and has many years of experience working in a number of industries. So why conduct risk analysis? Well, risk analysis helps our project teams and executives understand and manage risks to the projects, gets the project team discussing the challenges of the project, and gets them focused on the right issues, things like the near critical paths that can come back and haunt the project. So as project managers, we typically do such a good job of managing critical path that it's no longer the critical path and something else becomes the critical path. And it's a big surprise to everybody. So risk analysis will really help us understand what are the things that are likely to become critical on the project, both on cost and schedule. It's a requirement of many companies' gate approval processes, but that's not really why you should be doing risk analysis. The real reason you should be doing it is to understand the dependencies between cost and schedule for the project team. Now, I'm located in Alberta, and there's a group here called the Construction Owners Association of Alberta. And that group puts out reports every couple of years around mega projects in my part of the world. One of their findings consistently has been that project risk assessment significantly reduces project cost and schedule growth. And they identified that as early as 2009. So people know we should be doing it, but why should we be doing it? Well, ask yourself, do you build detailed CPM schedules? Do you develop detailed cost estimates? Well, of course you do. Everybody does. But the chances of meeting our project schedule and financial goals are still typically pretty small. How can this be? Well, we do detailed CPM scheduling, but the problem is we enter all of the data as finite values rather than ranges of uncertainty. So we say this activity is going to take 4 days with 3 people working on it, and they're going to cost us $100 an hour. But the problem is that what if it takes us 5 days? Or what if the crew is 4 people? Or now the cost is $125 an hour? And the thing is, assumptions will change over time. And sometimes those assumptions that we made when we built the estimate don't match the reality when we actually go to build the project. The project itself changes. It might change in scope. It might change in time. It might change in site conditions. And all of those things have an impact on the project that typically aren't in our original estimate. So we also do detailed estimating, but there's a problem there too. Sometimes our estimators are too optimistic or too pessimistic. Typically, open bid process encourages aggressive estimates. Other times, estimators add contingency and they hide it here and there because everyone knows if you have a contingency line item, someone's going to take it away. Sometimes those estimates are based on historical experience or smaller or larger projects, which don't turn out to be accurate. So estimates may not scale linearly with the project, and estimates based on historical experience may be no longer valid. So all these items are what we call deterministic. So the problem is deterministic items don't take uncertainty into account. And uncertainties can build on one another to make the project very different from what was originally planned. Now, there's uncertainty in everything that we do. The classic example is, how long does it take you to drive to work every day? Well, for me, it typically takes me about 20 minutes to drive to work. But right now, it takes me more like 45 minutes because there's construction going on and I have to take a big detour. If you asked me 2 years ago if that construction was going to go on, I would probably have not known anything about it. But now it's something I have to deal with every day. It's getting to winter. Sometimes it snows. That adds 5 minutes to my trip. I might go first thing on Sunday morning and it takes me less time because there's nobody else on the road. So there's uncertainty in just getting to work. And yet people are asking me to predict exactly how long and how much money I need to spend on a project I've never done before. So we need to make sure that we're actually able to build those uncertainties into our schedule and cost models. So what we need is a probabilistic model as opposed to a deterministic model. Again, going back to the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, on average, Alberta-based mega projects experience a 19% project cost growth and a 17% project schedule growth. Now, this is interesting because there's very definitely a strong correlation between cost and time on our projects. We all intuitively know that if a project goes late, it's going to cost more money. And we all know that if you're trying to accelerate a project, you're going to spend money to do it. But what we really need to do as a project team is we need to understand those interdependencies. So we need to model our schedules and costs more accurately. We need to limit our financial exposure. We need reproducible results. So we need a methodology that we can apply to all of our projects. We need to improve the likelihood our projects are going to be successful. We need to get buy-in from the team members and set it up so that we can increase our maturity when we're doing risk analysis and help the project teams deliver projects on time and on budget. And one of the ways we want to do that is we want to get everything in a common database so we're not always trying to find files that are hidden all over the place in people's personal drives. So the best solution on the market, in my opinion, is Safran risk analysis. Safran lets you put uncertainty inputs into the system, including ranges on estimates. It lets you model risk events. It lets you model detailed logic uncertainty. And most importantly, I think, it allows you to model your costs and schedule together. Now, that has been identified as an industry best practice by both PMI and AACE. And it's one of the things that Safran does very well, modeling our costs and schedules in one integrated model. So by doing so, we can understand the probability of achieving our end date requirements and our end cost requirements. We can understand what's driving the cost and schedule. We can look at the interdependencies between them and what trade-offs we can make between cost and schedule. And we're able to run different scenarios and understand our mitigation strategies. So let's take a look at the tool. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so when you come into Safran Risk, you have a little splash screen, and in that screen, you can open an existing project, you can import a project from Safran, or you can import a project from P6 or Microsoft Project. You also have a list of all your recent projects, and up at the top here, we have some tabs that give us additional information that's available to us. One of them is we can have what we call global risks, and global risks are risks which impact more than one project. So we can make this dictionary essentially of risks that we can apply to any of our projects. Now, this is really powerful because if we have a whole bunch of projects with similar risks, we don't have to model them independently each time. We can just pull them in and use them. So if you've got a number of projects in the same part of the world with the same political risks or physical risks, you can just reuse those over and over again. We also have the ability to define risk calendars. And the idea there is, what's the probability that we're going to lose some time in a particular period due to bad weather or high winds or anything else, strike action, moose hunting season opens, whatever it happens to be. We can model those again as risk calendars, which again are global and can be applied to any of our projects. So if we know, for example, that in northern Alberta, where I am, we're going to lose, 1 day in 5 in the winter, we can actually build that right in as a probabilistic calendar, and then we can apply that to any of the projects going on in that part of the world. So let's go back to the home screen. I'm going to open up an existing project. Now, when I open up a project um, in the tool, it's going to first of all take me to the schedule screen. And the idea here is that Safran Risk is built on Safran Project. Now, Safran Project is a lot like P6. You can do all of your scheduling and all of your changes and modifications and everything in Safran Project. You can create filters and layouts and everything just like you would in P6. And the idea here is that, I don't necessarily have to go back and to P6 or Microsoft Project every time I want to make a change. I can work right in the tool. Now, I also have the ability in here to set up filters that will carry through the entire tool. So for example, if I was to go down here and apply a filter for, say, design work, when I actually move to the subsequent tabs in my risk model, I will also only see design work. So these filters carry forward. So this makes it very useful if I want to work on just one phase of a large project. So maybe I've got engineering, procurement, construction, commissioning, and startup, and I just want to work on design risk today. I can filter down on just the design activities and just work with those rather than have to deal with the whole schedule as I do the risk analysis modeling. So again, very powerful from that perspective. I'm going to turn that off. So we've got everything here. Now, the next tab across, and by the way, I'm going to work from left to right as I go through and build my model. So Safran is very much built around the idea of a workflow. So rather than a Primavera risk analysis where I used to have everything built on menus, here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work my way left to right, which makes things much easier for new users to work with. Primavera risk analysis had a very steep learning curve because you had to remember where everything was. So I'm going to go to the next tab, which is my schedule warnings tab. So it's going to warn me about anything that could potentially cause a problem with my risk analysis. And on the options section, I can define what I'm looking for here. So I can tell it the things I care about and things I don't care about. In this case, it's telling me that you've got some lags in there that are fairly long, and you've got some open ends. Well, the open ends are my start and finish milestones, so that's okay. If I want to go look at the lags, what I can do is I can just go and review those lags and make sure that they're things that I can live with. If not, I can go and fix them and then come back, and it will immediately show me what's going on. Now, the next tab over is my project risks. So project risks are all of the risks I have associated with this particular project. Now we have different kinds of risks. Let's just take this first one and take a look at it. So it's this ash cloud risk. Now, there's a lot of information here about this particular risk. The first thing is, what kind of risk is it? So if I click the drop down here, we've got a standard risk. So a standard risk is a risk where I define the probability of occurrence between 1 and 100%. I also define what the impact of that risk is going to be. So I can have multiple standard risks associated with any of the activity or cost elements in my model. So I might have 5 or 6 risks on a particular cost item, and I might have 3 or 4 different risks on a schedule item. So I'm going to show you how we map that in just a couple of minutes. I can also have a calendar risk. I can have an estimate uncertainty risk. The difference between an estimate uncertainty and a standard risk is that estimate uncertainties are always 100%, which is why we have a gray out on these ones that say estimate uncertainty. They're always 100% likely. And while I can assign many standard risks to an activity or cost element, I can only associate one estimate uncertainty. The idea is it can't be a low estimate uncertainty and a medium estimate uncertainty and a high estimate uncertainty at the same time. It's going to be one of the 3. Whereas with standard risks, I can put as many as I want on there. Now, I can also define non-existence, which basically means that my activity will appear or disappear. Same with my cost element. So the idea there is what I can do is I can say when there's an existence risk, that thing occurs or doesn't occur. I can also have one for probabilistic branching, which allows me to change the logic in my schedule. This is only for scheduling and not for costing, but it allows me to change the logic in the schedule based on some event happening. So I don't get an approval. I have to go through a whole review cycle and reapproval cycle before the project can proceed. So I've got those in there as well. For an item which is a standard risk, I can define the schedule impact of that particular risk and the cost impact of that risk. So 40% of the time, this risk is going to fire. When it fires, this is what the impact is going to look like. So I've got a relative distribution here, which is saying, look at the duration of the original activity. The minimum and likely are 100% of that, which means if I have a 20-day activity, then I'm going to end up with the minimum duration being 20, the most likely being 20, but the worst case is going to be 165%, which is going to take me to 33 days. So an impact can be relative or an impact can be absolute. If it's absolute, I define the impact in days specifically. Similarly with cost impacts, my cost impact can be a percentage of the original cost, or it can be, again, an absolute impact. So if something happens, I can say it's going to cost me this many dollars. Now, in addition to what we call our pre-mitigated position, I can also define a post-mitigated position. So the post-mitigated position is going to show me perhaps a different probability of occurrence. So in this case, it's going from 40% down to 15%. And I can have a different impact as well. So my post-mitigated position would be after I've done my workshop. So this would be long after I built the initial model. I sit with the project team, figure out what we're going to do to reduce or transfer this risk, or what we're going to do with this risk. I can also define what actions I'm going to take to actually affect this mitigation strategy. So in this case, I'm going to put a 30-day extension on this activity, and I'm going to take a hit of $50,000. So I'm going to spend $50,000, but that's going to get me from 40% likely down to 15% likely. Then what I can do is I can evaluate whether it's worth doing this risk mitigation or not worth doing this risk mitigation. Sometimes the mitigation is so expensive or takes so much time that it's just not worth doing, right? We're better to just accept the risk as it is, be aware of it, and try and do everything we can to minimize it. But sometimes we're better off not to actually execute a mitigation strategy. And by putting the cost and time impact of that mitigation strategy in the model, I can easily evaluate that. Okay, so we've got all of our risks in here. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the risk mapping tab. So the risk mapping tab is where we actually can take our risks and associate them to the activities in the schedule. So in this case, you'll see here that I've got two different kinds of risks in my columns. I've got these ones on the left, which all have radio buttons, and I've got these ones on the right, which are square check boxes. So what's the difference? Well, the ones on the left are my estimate uncertainty risks. And remember, I said I can only choose one of them. So in this example here for design GPS system, for example, I've got a medium uncertainty on that. If I change it, excuse me. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. If I want to go to a high uncertainty, you notice that the radio button changes and the first one gets deselected. So I can only choose one of my estimate uncertainty values, but I can choose multiple of my standard risks. So in this case, let's just pull up this divider so we can see a little better. I've got this design GPS system. If I look at the schedule impact, it shows me here's all of the risks that are associated with this particular activity. Move that out of the way. So you can see here that I've got my ash cloud risk, I've got my merger or acquisition risk, I've got my design risk, and I've got my medium uncertainty risk. Now what the tool does is it says, okay, with all those risks that you've defined, here's what the distribution looks like on this particular activity. So this is really useful because it lets me preview what's going to happen with all of those risks associated with this particular activity. Now, if I add another risk, like maybe I add the communications risk, the system immediately adds that one, and it will then redraw the distribution shape to show me what it looks like with that new risk added. So it does a little Monte Carlo analysis to show me what that distribution looks like. So again, if I pick something that's totally out of whack, that is really going to skew my distribution, I'm going to see it immediately, and I can say, "Oh, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't be assigning that risk because it's not appropriate." I'll just turn it back off. Um, so there's a lot of really good information in here. Now, one other thing that you can do, a lot of our customers that are coming to Safran Risk are coming from Primavera risk analysis, and they're used to doing 3-point estimates on the individual activities. And so in addition to the risks, they still want to be able to put their 3-point estimates on. So you can do that as well. We just have to turn that on. And then you can actually put a distribution shape, 3-point estimate, on each activity in addition to the risks that we've defined. So you can do both in the tool. So if you have models built around these 3-point estimates, you can still manage them that way in Safran, and you still have all the flexibility of adding in the risks and the uncertainties in the mapping. Now, the next tab is cost. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip that one. Now, I'm going to come back to it, and I'm going to show you how the cost works after we've done the schedule side. Now, typically in the real world, those would go on in lockstep, but since I can only show one thing at a time, I'm going to come back to the cost tab. We also have the next tab over is where we can define our correlations. So if anybody who's built risk models knows that quite often we need to correlate our model. So we need to say, okay, if the first piling activity goes badly, chances are they're all going to go badly. Or if we have labor trouble at the beginning of the project, we're probably going to have labor trouble throughout the entire project. Or we might say, if our ash cloud risk fires, then we're probably going to have trouble with parts supply, because if we can't actually fly our model, we probably can't fly our parts in either. So again, what we can do is we can use this grid to correlate the probability of risks occurring at the same time, the impacts from a schedule perspective or the impacts from a cost perspective can also be correlated. So this gives us a lot of flexibility in a very simple grid pattern. Now we can do that for pre-mitigated. We can also build a different correlation distribution for our post-mitigated model. And we can also do it based on our schedule and cost model uncertainties as well. So there's a lot of options in the correlation model. I'm not going to spend any more time on that today, but if you have any questions about it, please let me know. So next we're going to go to the Analyze tab. Now, for those of you who might have worked with Primavera risk analysis, it was kind of an all or nothing in terms of how you built your model. You could have a pre-mitigated model, or you could have a post-mitigated model, but you couldn't mix and match the two unless you're willing to do a lot of extra data entry. One of the things that's really nice about Safran is I can actually, on the left side of the screen here, is I can move a risk from the pre-mitigated position to the post-mitigated position, or I can move all the risks to the post-mitigated position if I want to run a fully post-mitigated. So I can mix and match, right? I can run some risks pre-mitigated, some risks post-mitigated, so I can really get an understanding of what's going on in the model. I can also turn off individual risks when I'm running the model. So if there's certain risks I want to just turn off and not use, I also have the ability to do that. So it gives me a lot of power when I'm trying to do some scenarios in my risk model to mix and match and say, okay, what if I run the post-mitigated position on this risk, the pre-mitigated position on this other risk, and this third risk I'm going to completely turn off. Helps you really understand what's going on within the model. I can also tell the system that I want to run either Latin hypercube or Monte Carlo sampling. I can include or not include correlations. I can resource level after each iteration of the model, which is very useful if you're resource leveling your source schedule. And I also have the ability to step through the analysis to make sure the model's working the way I expect. Finally, on the left side of the screen, I can define focus activities and focus costs. So what's a focus activity? Well, a lot of times when I'm working with a risk model, I don't really care about the entire schedule. What I care about is some intermediate milestone in the schedule, like what we call TCCC, transfer of care, custody, or control. In other words, when the project gets turned over to the owner. What I don't care about is site cleanup, demobilization, all that kind of stuff, because that's not putting my budget at risk. Yes, it has to be done, but if I've turned the plant over, if it takes me a month to do site cleanup or 6 weeks, it's not really going to be a huge issue from the perspective of when do I deliver this thing. So the idea is I can define focus activities, which are intermediate activities that I really care about, and I want to make sure that they're being monitored. Similarly, I can do the same with focus costs. So I can define certain items in my cost worksheet that I really care about, and other items that maybe I don't care about so much, I can ignore. Okay, so I'm going to run the analysis. Now, remember, I'm on step through, so the system does one iteration and stops. And then what I can do is I can just click and step through and see the impact of my risks on my overall schedule. And I can do that as many times as I want. This is set up for 1,000 iterations, so I'm not going to really want to do it 1,000 times. But the idea is I can move around in the time scale just to make sure things are moving the way I expect. Okay, so I just want to make sure if there's some activity that's not moving and I think it should be, then I can go in and figure out why. Perhaps it's because there's a constraint in there, or there's some missing logic, or whatever it may be. This is just a quick way to make sure everything's moving the way I expect. But when I've done it enough times to be confident, I can hit complete. And the system comes up with a distribution graph. Now, the distribution graph is pretty standard in the industry. What it tells me, the bars represent how many hits out of 1,000 each particular date came up. And because I have that information, I can do a cumulative line based on cumulative numbers of hits. So we did 1,000 iterations. If we look at a certain confidence level, say P80, what the system says is that 80% of the hits came on or before March the 3rd. So what that's telling me is if I want an 80% confidence level, I can tell management will be finished on or before March the 3rd. So very useful information, and I can choose any particular confidence level I want to work with, or I can go look at my deterministic confidence level, which is this blue line down the bottom here, and it tells me that the probability of achieving your deterministic end date is about 4%. The difference between my deterministic date and my P80 date is shown by the curtain here, and it says that's 159 days, or 28% additional time that you're going to need to complete this project. Now, okay, so let's say that I'm not happy with that. 159 days seems like a lot on this little project. What's causing that? Well, we can then go to the next tab, which is the drivers tab. And the drivers tab tells us these are the items that are having the biggest impact on the project. So looking at it from a risk perspective, it tells us that the ash cloud is having the highest impact, followed by testing overrun, followed by e-communication, followed by procurement delays, etc. Now, I can look at the same on individual activities and see which activities are having the biggest impact. But being able to look at this on the basis of our risks is very powerful. So the idea here is that this top item, our ash cloud, it has a correlation of 0.63. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when we look at the correlation between when this risk fires and goes long, the whole project tends to fire and go long as well. So essentially, if we look at this one at 0.63, we look at the next one at 0.48, we can say this one's having about a 25% bigger impact than the next one down. Well, that's good information, but it's not really what the project team wants to hear. What the project team wants to know is how much of an impact in days is this risk having on the project? You can tell me it's correlated at 0.63, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot to me as a project manager. I want to know what's the impact on the project. Well, we have a tool to do that. So we can go to the next tab, which is our sensitivity analysis. We can look at the impact on the overall project or on any of our focus activities. So again, if we have our focus activities that we really care about, we can choose those. I'm going to look at the overall project at the P80 confidence level, and I can look at the impacts. And what the system tells me is that that ash cloud is having an impact of 36 days. Okay, testing overrun is having an impact of 33 days, and these are at a P80 confidence level. If I wanted to look them at a different confidence level, I can define any confidence level I want to look at and see what the impact is there as well. But in this case, at P80, my ash cloud is having a 35-day impact. So again, this is really powerful because now what I can do is I can go back to the project team and say, hey, if we can get rid of this ash cloud risk, we can save 35 days on the schedule. Now our variance, going back to our distribution graph, was 159 days. So I can reduce that by 25% just by, if I can deal with this ash cloud risk. So again, very powerful because it helps me understand and communicate to the project team in real terms what the impacts are going to look like. Okay, so now I said I was going to come back to cost, so I'm going to do that now. So let's go to the cost tab. Now, the idea here is that I can build my cost model. And let me just turn off some columns here to make it a little easier to see. So I can build my cost model. I can put my line items in here. I can have a base cost. I can have a uncertainty on that base cost. I can define quantities and total cost for these. So I can actually, if I don't want to just put a number in here, I can actually build it up by saying, okay, this is going to be, say 2,500 weld inches at so many dollars per weld inch. And I can build it up that way, and then I can build uncertainty on the elements that build up that particular line item. So in this case, if I scroll down a little bit, I've got a project manager time here, and in there, I have said, okay, for project manager time, I'm going to need a project manager, and using a formula, then I can say, okay, the project manager is going to cost me between $50 and $70 an hour, and it's going to be linked to this particular activity in my schedule. So I can build up a formula. In the case of legal costs, I can say, I'm going to spend so much per day on legal costs, and I can build up a formula there as well. So you can just put the base numbers in from your cost estimate, or if there's uncertainty around quantities, you can actually use formulas as well. Now, once I've actually defined what my cost element looks like, let's go back to this construction resources one. So I've said it's $470,000, but it could be as little as 376 or as much as 505. So I've got a base uncertainty distribution. Then what I can do is I can tell the system which risks are associated with this particular line item. So just like I did on the schedule, I can map my risks to my cost line items. So any risk that has a cost element associated with it will appear on this list, and I can assign it to the line item in the cost worksheet. So in this case, I've got my construction resources is impacted by my ash cloud risk and my design risk. Now, just like I did with the activities in the schedule, I can look at what the risks are associated with this, and I can look at what the impact of those risks is going to look like. So in this case, what I can do is I can actually, let's choose one that has some better information on it. There we go. Okay. So I can preview what the risk impact is going to look like. Now, once I've done that, once I've actually built my risk model, now what I can do is I can actually go and I can link this to my schedule. So the idea here is that some of my items in my cost worksheet would be schedule related, and some of them would not be schedule related. So what I can do is I can define which items are which cost items are schedule related and which cost items are not schedule related, and therefore I can understand the interdependency between cost and schedule. So, for example, let's put the columns back on. Let's see, where'd my column picker go? One second here. Let me just go out and back in. My little selection box to turn the schedule links back on has disappeared. 1 second. I think I'm gonna have to come back in. Okay, 1 second here. Let me just restart this. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so let's go back to our costs. There's our selection box again. Okay, so we're going to turn the schedule connection columns on. And I'm going to turn off the quantity distribution just to give myself a bit of room here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is let's take one of our line items, and what we're going to do is we're going to tie that to the schedule. So in this case, we have parts for the fuel system. We have a line item which is $2.4 million. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that some portion of that $2.4 million is linked to our schedule. So what we want to do is we're going to say that 25% of that $2.4 million is linked to the schedule. The other 75% is not linked to the schedule. So what we do is we go to our schedule link section. And what we're going to do is you can see here that we can choose any particular schedule activity. Then what we can do is we can say what percentage of that cost line item relates to that particular activity. So you can choose as many activities as you want, and you can, as long as the percentage is less than or equal to 100%, it allows you to assign them. And then what it does is it's going to break down the fixed versus variable component of that cost line item. So what it will do here is it will say, okay, this is a 20-day duration, and it's going to calculate then what the fixed and variable costs are going to look like. So for example, if I were to add another one in here, I could add in another, say, 35%, right? And then it will calculate again what the day rate is going to look like, and it will do the calculation for me based upon that. So the idea here is that when I'm working within the tool, the system is going to say, okay, for the items that are schedule related, this is what the distribution is going to look like. And it will then, as the activities go long, the cost will increase. As the activities go short, the cost will decrease, but only for that section that's variable as opposed to the whole thing. So now when I go and do my analyze, it's going to take all of that into consideration. So if I go to my let's rerun the analysis here. Now, when I go to my cost section, it's going to show me the overall cost of the project with all of my risks and everything defined. And what it's going to tell me here, when I actually open this up, if I can choose any particular item in here, so maybe my parts for fuel system, or if I choose any of my others, let's find one that actually has some variation on it here. It's going to show me overall what that distribution shape looks like. So what the system is telling me here is just like I did with the schedule, it's saying that my probability of achieving my deterministic cost, which was $1.2 million, again, is pretty low. It's about 4%. To get to my P80 value, I need to be up around $1.9 million. So you can see there's a big difference between my deterministic cost and my P80 cost of about $670,000. Now, one of the things that's really nice about building this kind of model is because I have my cost and schedule together, I can now look at this from the perspective of my joint cost and schedule impact, or my probability of achieving what we call our JCL. But before we do that, let's just take a quick look at our cost drivers. So just like we could look at schedule drivers, we can look at cost drivers. So again, we can see on our distribution, what's the risk that's having the biggest impact on our cost model. In this case, it's testing overrun. We can go to the sensitivity analysis. And again, we can see what are the big drivers for on the cost side. So there's my schedule impact, but here's my cost impact. So it's telling me overall my cost uncertainty is having the biggest impact. So those are those uncertainties that I put on each line item, followed by my testing overrun. So, going back to the previous screen with the drivers, I can see here that if I could get rid of my testing overrun, I could save about $192,000 on this project, again, at a P80 confidence level. So I mentioned before this idea of joint confidence level. Well, if I look at my scatter plot, where I've got what's the probability of achieving my joint confidence level? So the idea here is, I said I'm 4% likely to be on schedule. I'm 4% likely to be on budget, which means that overall, I basically have no chance of achieving both. If I look here, there's actually one or two hits in this lower left corner of the screen where I'm actually meeting my joint confidence level, right? So in this case, I can look at these and say, hey, each of these hits represents a cost and a schedule. Where did I end up overall? Well, if I really want to have a higher confidence level, maybe what I want to do is I want to say, okay, how much contingency do I need to get a joint confidence level up around the level that I'm looking for. So I'm just going to change this to my JCL band coloring scheme here. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that I want to know what's the probability of hitting my 80% confidence level for cost and schedule. Well, what you can see here is in my coloring, the breakpoint between my 80% is the interface between these orange dots and these red dots. So I can say, for example, if I'm here on this dot, I'm at 79%. So for all intents and purposes, 80%. Finishing on March the 7th at a cost of $2.35 million. Okay. Now I could also see that if I go down to this dot down here, I'm now at March 25th at a cost of $2.1 million. So in this case, you can see that any of these points along this interface are all getting me to my 80% confidence level, but there's a trade-off here between cost and schedule. So, for example, if I were to say, okay, I'm going to change my target date from my deterministic date to March the 25th, and I'm going to change my cost from the deterministic cost to 2.17 million. So that puts me at 80%. But here's the thing, any of these points along that line will also give me an 80% confidence level. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm not that worried about schedule. I'm much more worried about cost on this project. Well, I could choose this point down here, which would let the project slide out by, about 6 weeks, but it would save me about $200,000. So these are the kind of trade-offs that the project team can make. Now, at some point, what happens, you'll see here, is that this line goes vertical. So at that point, you can spend all the money you want, but you're not going to save any time. And that's why it starts to go vertical. You see this point up here is 80%. We're still on March the 3rd, and we're spending $2.8 million, as opposed to, say, this point down here, where we're on March the 13th at 2.4 million. So we're spending a lot of money and saving very little time. So similarly, you get down here where it goes horizontal, and you can give up a lot of time. In this case, we could go all the way out to September, and we're still sitting at $1.97 million. So you're not really saving any more money. So, but in between those, the vertical and the horizontal sections is where the project team can actually play around, or I shouldn't say play around. It can actually trade off cost versus schedule. So these points, all of these points along here are where we have a P80 success. But again, the project team can decide what the trade-off is going to look like. Now, a lot of people call this the JCL necklace, because it's all of these pearls essentially that are all showing project success, and we can decide where we want to be on that. Okay. So that concludes the presentation part. Let's go back to our slides here. So let's talk a little bit about people who are using Safran Risk. So Safran has projects all over the world, and a lot of clients have been moving from Primavera risk analysis to Safran because of the more modern look and feel, the ability to do joint cost and schedule analysis. And really, for people who are looking for something to upgrade, this is a great tool. So now we'll open it up to any questions that people may have. You can either type the questions into the questions box in the screen, and we'll be happy to answer them, perhaps by showing them in the tool. If Um, if we don't get any questions, you can also reach out to me and I'll put my contact information up in just a couple of minutes. Okay, there's a question here saying for activities of interest, can that be a WBS node? So when we go back and look at our, go back to the Analyze tab, where we have our focus activities, um, we can only choose activities. But if we want to look at an entire WBS, there's two things we could do. We can create a hammock activity like the one here, and we can use that, which can be used. Or what we can do is, if I go to my drivers, for example, I can actually, so the schedule drivers, I can actually choose a WBS here so that if I wanted to look at the impact on a particular WBS, I can choose it on the pick list on the side, but I can't make it a focus activity.
Ian, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, here. Sorry. Let me go over that again. 1 second here. Okay. So going back to the question. So when I have a focus activity, I can choose different activities, but I cannot choose a WBS element. But what I can do is I can make a hammock activity, and I can make that a focus activity. So those are available. But the other thing I can do is when I'm actually looking at my distribution graph, for example, I can choose a WBS element by just browsing down the list. And by the way, whatever grouping I'm using in the schedule tab, so just like the filters, if I have a if I'm grouped by WBS, then that grouping appears here as well. If I'm grouped by an activity code or user defined field, that's how it's going to be grouped here as well. So a lot of flexibility here in how I move around, but absolutely I can choose a WBS and look at the impact on that whole WBS. All right. If there's any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, what I'll do is I will put my contact information here. So if anyone thinks of any questions that we didn't cover or has a specific example they'd like to talk about, we can cover those as well. So feel free to reach out to us. And with that, we will wrap up for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to hear from you.